So, all right. Just give us a little bit of backdrop before we get into the specifics of this case that is going to the Supreme Court regarding voting rights. Give us a little bit of backdrop and where in the context in which this case takes place.
Sure. So, I mean, the big macro backdrop, Sam, is that there's all of these efforts by Republicans to make it harder to vote, particularly for Democratic-leaning constituencies to vote. And Republicans are trying to think of more sophisticated ways to both make it harder for Democrats to vote and also to remove them from the voter rolls. So, you show up on election day, you think you're registered and you're not registered, and then you can't vote. And one of the ways they've done this in Ohio is basically to use non-voting as a reason to remove you from the roll. So if you don't vote in an election and then the state of Ohio sends you a notice and then you don't respond to the notice because most people don't respond to these kind of notices, then you don't vote for 2 more elections, you can be removed from the rolls in Ohio for no other reason than that you didn't vote. And so that is what is being challenged in this case before the Supreme Court. So on the one hand, it's quite narrow. Can Ohio remove people from the rolls for non-voting? On the other hand, it's a much bigger case because it deals with all of these larger efforts by Republicans to make it harder to vote, and the fact that Republicans are trying to weaken the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, because they've already weakened the Voting Rights Act, remember, of 1965. Now they're going after the next voting rights law that passed, the National Voter Registration Act. So it seems like a narrow case, but I think it has pretty big significance.
Okay, so before we get to the National Voter Registration Act, I want to talk about that. But what is the argument? I mean, what is, from the plaintiff's, or I guess the defendant's perspective, the state of Ohio, what is the what could possibly be the argument that because you have decided not to vote in the past 2 elections, or you couldn't vote, or whatever it was, that you should be ineligible to vote going forward? What possibly could be the argument?
Well, I think Ohio's argument is that they want to maintain accurate voting rolls, and that if the voting rolls are inaccurate, that could lead to increased voter fraud. That is basically their argument. Now, the problem with that argument is, number one, non-voting is not an indication of any sort of fraud. It's just an indication that someone chose not to vote for one reason or another. And it's probably somewhat true that if you don't vote in 2008, you won't vote in 2016, but there are certainly people that, for one reason or another, sit out a few elections. They're not inspired, or there's something else going on in their lives. They decide that they want to vote again. So it is a really weird thing to use this, and what the ACLU and other people who are arguing against Ohio's process are basically saying is that you're making voting a use it or lose it right. That essentially, if you choose to opt out of the process, you're just being removed as a voter altogether, which is not how the system or the law is supposed to work.
Yeah, and it seems bizarre. I mean, if you were really concerned with the integrity of that voter list, you could simply ask the people. You could just instruct your poll workers. If someone hasn't voted for 2 elections, you need to confirm that with them when they show up to vote, right? I mean, it's absurd.
Well, and that's why very few states do this. Very few states use non-voting. And in fact, the National Voter Registration Act says that people can't be removed for non-voting. So instead, the Ohio has engaged in this semantics game where they're saying, we're not removing people from non-voting, we're removing them because we sent them a mailing one time and they didn't respond to it. Well, the statistics show that 70% of mailings from the government go in the trash. So that's not a very good indicator. But I think basically what states like Ohio are doing is they're trying to find more sophisticated and sneakier ways to kick people off the voting rolls. And so this is just one way in which they're trying to do it. And we've seen that this has a disproportionate impact on certain communities, that according to a Reuters analysis, black voters in Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati, the biggest cities in the state, were twice as likely as whites to be removed from the rolls. People in minority neighborhoods move more often. They're less likely to get a government mail. They're more likely to be targeted by Republicans in the first place. So these kind of voter purges, while they seem kind of race neutral and party neutral on the face of them, clearly hurt some voters more than others.
Yeah, and I suspect that's not a coincidence. Well, all right. So I mean, here's this feels like a fairly narrow question, right? I mean, can you be dismissed from the voter rolls for not having voted for 2 elections, or because you're not responding to these to this postcard that's questioning your status. How broad is it? I mean, will this, are we looking for a response from the Supreme Court that says, well, if you haven't voted in 18 years, that's one thing, but if you haven't voted in 12 years, or is there a broader principle? And is that basically around this National Voter Registration Act?
Well, I think the worry here is that if the Supreme Court gives Ohio an opening, it's going to lead to not only more voter purges, but it's going to lead to new challenges to the National Voter Registration Act. And any time a voting rights law is weakened, usually another law is attacked. And I knew this would happen. I knew that once Republicans went after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and didn't have to clear their voting changes with the federal government, they would then go after the next target, which is the National Voter Registration Act of 93, which basically says you have to be able to register the DMV and other public agencies, and you can't just be removed from the voting rolls. Because what was happening is that states, even after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, were making registration really difficult. They were making it so that you could only register at the county courthouse, or you could just be removed from the rolls in lots of arbitrary ways. And so the National Voter Registration Act of 93, which Bill Clinton signed, was kind of like the Voting Rights Act 2.0, which was to build on the progress of the Voting Rights Act and try to get at these more sophisticated ways that people were still being disenfranchised. And so I think that this bill has a target on its back by Republicans. And I think if the Supreme Court rules in Ohio's favor, that it could open the door to broader voter purging and broader efforts to make registration more difficult. It's possible that the Supreme Court will decide it very narrowly on one side or the other, and it won't have a national impact. But I think basically what we're seeing is that at a time that when voting rights has become nationalized, when so many states are paying attention to what other states are doing, even a narrow opinion in one state has national significance.
I've seen you write that Ohio purged, I think it was 2 million voters from 2011 to 2016. I mean, does that explain why Ohio feels like it's no longer a battleground state?
I'm not sure if that entirely explains it, but I think that efforts in Ohio to make it more difficult to vote have led to larger Republican majorities. You know, they didn't just do that, but they eliminated the first week of early voting when you could also register to vote at the time. There's been a lot of gerrymandering in the state. And so I think that all of these efforts are an attempt to try to lock in the Republican majorities in these places, particularly in the quintessential swing states. So I think, you know, Ohio's kind of faded from the radar because it wasn't that close in 2016. But we shouldn't forget just how closely it was decided in elections like 2004 and how important of a swing state Ohio is. So this is a state, like, this isn't like a challenge from Texas, which is a red state, but has some blue areas. I mean, this is what was until 2016 really the quintessential swing state. So I think whatever happens in Ohio has national significance for that reason as well.
All right. Well, we're going to take a break here. All right. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about how you anticipate this case going down. And a little bit more, get a better sense of the National Voting Registration Act. What other aspects of it are in jeopardy if this attack on it succeeds coming out of Ohio? And then I also want to touch base with you because we haven't spoken since the demise of the election, the so-called Election Integrity Committee. This, of course, was the Chris Kobach-headed anything but Election Integrity Committee. And I want to talk to you about that as well. We got to take a quick break. I'm talking to Ari Berman of Mother Jones. I'm Sam Cedar. This is Ring of Fire Radio.